This journey will take us through Egypt's main archaeological sites and the remains of the pharaoh's culture following the course of the Great River Nile. Obviously, the Great Pyramids will hold a special place. The Saqqara Pyramid is a step pyramid. It is a very ancient monument, part of a rich funerary complex. The Dendera temple was dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love. In Karnak, the sun god is venerated. Just down the Nile, the Ramesseum is a testimony of the cult to the king Ramses II. The Luxor temple was paired with the temple of Karnak. They were connected by a path lined with sphinxes. In Edfu, Horus the falcon-headed god ruled the city of Edfu. The Kom Ombo temple is highly original as it is dedicated to two deities, Horus and Sobek. On the Philae island, the god-mother Isis is venerated. She is the universal woman, wife, and mother. The 5,000 years of Egyptian civilization are usually cut up in several eras: the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdom, interjected with intermediary periods. It was in the 3rd millennium BC that the first pharaohs of the ancient empire were born. As his authority grows, the king was furthermore deified. It is the era of pyramids, starting with the stepped versions at Saqqara and culminating in Giza under the 4th dynasty. It will witness the birth of the basis for architecture, painting, and sculpting that will be used throughout the Middle Kingdom. 1,000 years later, during the years 1500 to 1000 BC, the New Kingdom was considered the most prosperous of Egypt's history. It is a period of evolution and refinement with a cultural rebirth. This period gave us some of the greatest architectural feats, such as Luxor. This temple is a rare example of a superbly preserved New Kingdom divine foundation. This period's most famous pharaoh is Ramses II, who impressed history. Ramses II reigned 66 years, which is exceptional for the time. He was renowned for his warring skills and for being a conqueror. As soon as his reign began, he had already edified his funerary temple, the Temple of a Million Years. The 1st millennia BC is known as the Late Period. It is characterized by constant power struggles and foreign sovereigns taking over: Ethiopians, Assyrians, and Libyans. Though from very different cultures, these new sovereigns embraced the Egyptian model and its culture. They asked to be proclaimed as pharaohs, attempting to relive the glory of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. The priests used these unpopular attitudes and took the power over the new foreign pharaohs. Despite a strong will to preserve the Ramesside heritage, Egypt was economically weakened and could not keep hold on its vastness, nor stem its decline. Afterwards, Egypt even became a province, firstly to the Persian Empire, then the Greeks under the Ptolemaic dynasty. The country would finally fall to the Roman Empire at the dawn of our era. Evidence of this can be found in Philae, where the Latin conquerors left traces, starting with a combination of gods and goddesses. These sites, abandoned and rediscovered in the 19th century thanks to the Egyptologists, tell the story of this great civilization.
The story of the first missionaries starts at Cairo and its surroundings. At that time, the south of the country is not visited much. It was the 16th and 17th century that brought strangers to Upper Egypt.
The first to come were religious groups, with Father François, Father Protet, and slowly they will travel south. They will even discover Thebes. One anonymous Venetian traveler in particular will take interest in this city and cross it, without actually knowing it was Thebes. The 19th century starts, bringing with it Bonaparte and his famous Egyptian expedition team from 1798 to 1801. It will be a considerable asset for Egypt's ancient culture, as it was a complete exploration, covering many domains. Indeed, Bonaparte came on his expedition with over 170 scholars. This group of specialists will gather a considerable amount of data that will trigger the first true discovery of an ancient civilization. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt is in a sense accredited to these scholars. This expedition will have a great impact everywhere, but mainly in France, as it was organized in France. An entire collection of documents were brought back and were used to create an important volume, the famous Description de l'Égypte, the description of Egypt. The French were not able to bring all the antiquities they had gathered during the expedition back to France. These antiques were blocked in Alexandria when the British fleet destroyed the French fleet. This confrontation and the subsequent destruction of the French fleet was followed by the capitulation of Alexandria that forced the French to hand over the antiquities they had collected to Great Britain. Even today, the British Museum holds the famous Rosetta Stone, the rubbings of which initiated Champollion's great discovery of the hieroglyphs. After Bonaparte's great expedition, more scientific endeavors will take place in Egypt, dig further and further, gathering even more data. One of the first great expeditions was the one led by Champollion, accompanied by Ippolito Rossellini. This Franco-Tuscan expedition was financed by King Charles X of France and the Grand Duke of Tuscany. The expedition lasted several years and resulted in an important collection documenting the civilization of the pharaohs. They crossed northern Egypt, arriving in Nubia. They made drawings and descriptive notes of all the monuments visited by the scholars. The documents made it possible to bring an entire catalogue of descriptions of the pharaohs and their reigns. This was an essential addition to the original Description de l'Égypte, or Description of Egypt. In the meantime, Champollion discovered the famous hieroglyphic language. These scholars not only described the monuments architecturally, but were also able to understand their function, because Champollion was able to examine them and read the hieroglyphic texts. Champollion va pouvoir lire sur place tous les textes qu'il va pouvoir examiner. Quelques temps plus tard, nous aurons aussi une autre expédition scientifique très importante, celle que va mener Richard Lepsius et ses équipes. C'est une expédition prussienne. Another important scientific expedition was led by Richard Lepsius and his teams after Champollion's time. It was a Prussian expedition. Following Champollion's steps, Lepsius visited the same sites and gathered more archaeological and epigraphic data. He published the famous Denkmäler in Germany, which represent a considerable amount of data on the Egypt of the pharaohs. In parallel to the scientific expeditions, the events that led to creating our current great museums took place. It's a peculiar time known as the War of the Councils. In the years 1815 to 1816, France had Bernardino Drovetti as its general counsel and Henri Salt as the British counsel, representing the British Empire. Que c'est à ce moment-là que vont se constituer
This is when the great European collections will become the richest, and particularly the French and the English collections.
Alors nous avons la visite en 1816 d'un certain Belzoni, qui, à la demande du consul
In
Salt,
1816, a certain Belzoni came here as ordered by the consul Salt with the specific aim of moving the bust of a statue in the second courtyard of the temple that was known until then as the Young Memnon. Belzoni began this operation in July 1816 and managed to transport this colossus from the Ramesseum by boat all the way to Alexandria.
Et puis le faire partir jusqu'à Alexandrie. Et d'Alexandrie, bien entendu, ce buste ira vers
From there, it went to England.
C'est aujourd'hui, bien sûr, le jeune Memnon.
Today, one of the most visited pieces of the British Museum is the same Young Memnon.
Alors, ça fait partie de toutes ces pièces majeures qui ont
Many major pieces were taken as time passed, in a period where antiquities were not protected by any legislation.
Donc, ce qui veut dire que finalement, tous ces voyageurs qui parcouraient l'Égypte,
Travelers could cross Egypt and were able to buy everything they wanted. Other objects were simply taken. This is why there are so many pieces in the museums. They were taken at a time when no real legislation operated the trade of antiquities.
Alors, le début de l'archéologie française, on le doit surtout à
We owe the beginnings of French archaeology to Mariette.
Évidemment, qui était quand même le fondateur d'abord.
He was the founder of the Service of Egyptian Antiquities and the first who thought and designed an archaeological museum in Cairo, the famous Boulak Museum in its first form.
Dans sa première version. Alors, Auguste Mariette a fouillé dans bien des sites en
Auguste Mariette conducted digs in many sites and has crossed the country from the Delta to Upper Egypt. His considerable excavations have enabled the collection of beautiful monuments and objects that were in the first place recorded, then brought to the first Egyptian museum in Boulak. The latter was later transferred at Mariette's death to the Giza Museum before being permanently relocated in the Great Museum of Pharaonic Antiquities, a recent creation dating back to 1902.
Qui remonte à 1902. Donc,
Mariette was the founder of the Service for Antiquities in 1858. From that moment, he set an effective legislation that enabled to regulate all archaeological concessions. They were gradually given to foreign excavators to ensure control over all archaeological sites. The initial adventure slowly structured itself and evolved, so when Mariette left the scene, Gaston Maspero took over. Maspero directed the Antiquities Service for a number of years and was also the founder of the École Française du Caire, the French School of Cairo. France truly started implementing itself in the Egyptian Egyptologist field. This school still exists today under the name of l'Institut Français de l'Archéologie Orientale, the French Institute of the Oriental Archaeology. A great number of French Egyptologists, archaeologists, and philologists attended this school. In the decades following Gaston Maspero, the French presence in Egyptian archaeology rose continuously, as the Egyptian Antiquities Service kept being directed by French experts for a long time, until the revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Le service des antiquités de l'Égypte continuera d'être dirigé par des experts français, jusqu'à la révolution finalement qui a été conduite par Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Today's context is very different, Egypt being the master of its destiny. Since the Nasserian Revolution, Egyptians have directed the Antiquities Service. Nowadays, some authorizations are given to foreign missions. These official missions ensure the upkeep of digs, restoration works, and conservations in the complex of archaeological sites to make sure we continue exploring them. These are short-term
long-term missions as the financing has greatly diminished, and Egypt no longer manages financing of foreign missions. Foreign missions now have to finance themselves. Today, these foreign expeditions work 1, 4, or 5 months per year on a single site. Their goal is to deepen and broaden the excavations, to make epigraphic, iconographic, or architectural surveys, and to restore or preserve a monument. Egyptologist research includes many archaeological missions that mix different nationalities, as there are French and British, as well as Germans, Italians, Spanish, Russians, and Americans. So we have a whole palette of nationalities working to further Egyptologist research in Egypt.
Donc on a pratiquement un grand éventail de nationalités, si vous voulez, dans la recherche égyptologique sur place en Égypte.
Another undeniable jewel of the Nile, this one constructed for the most part under the 18th and 19th dynasties in the 14th century BC, the Temple of Luxor or Opet in the south is an Egyptian temple dedicated to the cult of Ammon. It is located on the site of the ancient city Thebes, the capital of the empire, which has also held the Karnak temple in the north. Dedicated to the divine triad of Thebes, Ammon, Mut, his wife, and Khonsu, their son, the Luxor temple functioned in partnership with that of Karnak, to which it was linked with path lined with sphinxes, a dromos over 2 kilometers long and bordered by 700 sphinxes, with those close to Luxor in the image of the pharaohs. Each year during the festival of Opet, the god Ammon would take this path to go to his southern harem in a grandiose procession. Luxor Temple is in some ways the complement to the great temple of Ammon at Karnak, as it was dedicated to the dynastic king's role as genitor, under the guise of Amun-Min, the impregnator. The oldest currently visible parts of the temple date back to Amenhotep III. It was later modified by Ramses II, who notably added 6 monumental statues and 2 obelisks, one of which was offered to France in 1831 and has stood in the Place de la Concorde in Paris since then. The Great Pylon entrance measures 65 meters wide and 24 meters high. Its 2 massifs were originally covered by a white primer decorated with precious metal plaques and sculpted decorations painted with vivid colors. Of the 6 colossal statues of Ramses II carved out of blocks of pink and gray granite, 2 sitting and 4 standing, there remains only 3, 2 sitting and 1 on foot. These giant effigies evoke the divine aspect of the king. Executed in the most pure style of the 18th dynasty, Luxor Temple constitutes an example of the divine foundation of the new kingdom that is rare for having remained so well preserved. Four baboons in poses of adoration are carved onto the pedestal of the pink granite obelisk that remains in place. This obelisk stands about 26 meters high and weighs around 230 tons. Its pyramidal summit was covered by a sheet of electrum, an alloy of 80% gold and 20% silver, which sparkled in the sunlight, symbolizing the sun god Ra. On each of its faces, 3 rows of vertical inscriptions repeat the name and titles of Ramses the Great, the glorifier of Thebes, favorite of the 2 goddesses, and having established monuments in Luxor for his father, Ammon, who placed him on the throne, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ra's chosen one. Luxor Temple was conceived according to a classical plan. Crossing the pylon through a narrow door, the procession which came from Karnak with the solar boat of the god Ra would first cross this courtyard before getting to the sanctuary, where the statuette of the god was kept in the precious naos. This first courtyard, built under Ramses II, is surrounded by porticos, including a double row of 74 massive columns that recall those of Karnak. With smooth bases and closed papyrus-shaped capitals. This majestic courtyard has a width of 50 meters and a length of 57, and each surface is covered by ceremonial inscriptions. To build this courtyard, Ramses' architect took into account the existence of a triple chapel repository to Hatshepsut. Constructed for the Theban triad, it would be restored by Ramses II on the occasion of the construction of the pylon. The chapel is preceded by fine columns in the form of papyrus bouquets of the 18th dynasty. The south end of courtyard is also ornamented by colossal statues that alternate with the columns. 11 giant statues on foot and 2 colossal statues sitting. The majority of them were sculpted in granite, and they all carried the name Ramses II. The colossal statue materializes 2 facets of the king, the human and the divine. The role of the colossal statue is the cult, the elevation of the king to divinity. Ramses II was a great theologian. He adopted for himself the initiative of the monotheistic cult of the sun begun by Akhenaten, but he also preserved the traditional religions. While working to develop a religion without borders based on his own person, he continued to favor the temples of the great gods of the empire, Amun, Ra, Ta, or Osiris, in order to bring the people together. He bestowed a splendor without equal to temples and cults to gods all over. 2 more sitting colossal statues in the form of Ramses the Great precede the entrance of the great processional colonnade. The bas-relief that ornaments the southern wall reveals the initial appearance of the pylon with the 2 obelisks and 6 colossal statues to us. This work shows the first 17 royal princes, conducted by Ramses II himself, who leads the inaugural procession and directs it towards the pylon. For the occasion of this solemn procession, large decorated bulls were brought to be sacrificed. The space between their horns was sometimes garnished with feathers, or sometimes the mask of a Nubian or the mask of a Semite. Their sacrifice was a substitute for that of the Nubian or Asian populations that, according to ancient tradition, each king had to put to death to ensure his triumph. Under the watch of the 2 colossal statues of the pharaoh, we cross the second pylon of Amenhotep III and enter the processional colonnade. Its columns are more than 20 meters high and mark the proper entrance to the temple. The structures of Amenhotep III began with this pylon and the colonnade of 14 papyrus-shaped columns with open capitals, the highest of all the remaining edifices conserved in the temple. This hall is made up of 2 rows of 7 bell-shaped, smooth columns, on top of which heavy architraves are placed. The processional colonnade constitutes the solemn entrance to the temple of Amenhotep III and measures some 52 meters. Because Thebes was the seat of divine and royal power, the simple local god Amun was merged with the universal sun god Ra. In this way, Amun-Ra acquired a dominant place above the other Egyptian gods, and upon which the power of the new pharaohs of the new kingdom was founded. The reliefs on the lateral walls of the pathway date back to Tutankhamun and Horemheb in the 14th century BC. They show the official festival of Opet. This celebration took place during the second month of the flood season. In a ceremonial boat pulled by a procession from the Nile River during its growth, the Theban triad of Amon, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu would travel from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, surrounded by soldiers, musicians, and dancers. There, the god Amon, taking on his fertile form Amen-Min, the phallic, rediscovered his vigor. And then, at the end of the celebrations that would last 11 days, he would return to Karnak, this time by way of the Great Dromos, still in the company of his divine family. Built around the sanctuary of Amen-Min, Luxor Temple was consecrated to the mystery of life that the god Amun, in the form of the beneficent Nile River, renewed each year. The colonnade leads to the second hypostyle courtyard. A great square courtyard 52 meters long and 46 meters wide, the solar court, is bordered on three sides by a double row of 64 papyrus capital columns with fluted polygonal bodies. The numerous architraves on which the name Amenhotep III is engraved still hold an unchanged freshness to this day and let you guess how impressive the courtyard must have been before. The solar boats cross the courtyard during the festival of Opet to take their place in small chapels arranged for this purpose, openings in the walls of the porticos. The sanctuary itself, or rather Amon's residence, as well as the rooms that precede it, have conserved a good part of their slab coverings. The first room of this covered area, the hypostyle hall, hold 32 papyrus columns of the same type as those of the courtyard arranged in 4 rows. It was illuminated by daylight, creating an intermediary space between the bright sun of the courtyard and the darkness of the small rooms of the temple. When the Romans transformed Luxor into a military camp in the 3rd century AD, the second hypostyle hall, called the vestibule, was transformed into a chapel of the imperial religion. After that, the walls were newly redecorated with a stucco primer and figures painted in a purely Greco-Roman style. They would later turn away from the religion, and a chapel in the honor of the great Emperor Augustus would even be erected. But let's go back to ancient times and another room with representations of the gods, located nearby at the end of the temple. This small room with 4 columns held the table of offerings. Here, during the 15 days of the festival of Opet, priests followed each other in, leaving the diverse fresh victuals that were necessary for the festivities of the gods. The The decorations show Amenhotep III paying tribute to God and receiving the crown of Egypt from the hands of his divine father Amon. Luxor is one of the most ancient holy places in the world. Indeed, the religious use of the site has continued more or less uninterrupted for more than 3,500 years, even if it was entirely reworked during the New Empire. The persistence of a religious location whose splendor hasn't ceased despite the somersaults of history. After having reached the door of the offering room, we enter into the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary room of the holy abode of the god Amon. The room was supported by 4 grand columns, the bases of which appear on the tiling. Among the adjoining rooms, including storerooms, we notice in particular the repository chapels dedicated to the Theban triad. On the walls, the king censes and offers libations and bouquets of flowers to Amon. The offerings, including the decorated bulls, are brought here by the king's butchers. The rooms leading up to the naos commemorate the myth of the king's supernatural origin in graven images. Amon will once again marry Mut, who will again give birth to Khonsu, a ritual where the pharaoh will also be reborn from his father Amon. Thus, each new reign favored the beginning of a new cycle. Furthermore, this allowed a celebration of the permanence of the royal function, periodically renewed by Amon. This was, in fact, the major function of such a temple. Paired with Karnak and Thebes, the ancient capital of the country, Luxor was certainly the most important religious site in Egypt during the New Kingdom. Dendera lies in Egypt on the banks of the Nile River around 65 kilometers to the north of Luxor. Begun under the reign of the last Ptolemy, the Temple of Dendera was finished during the Roman Empire under the Emperor Nero around the year 60 AD. This site is extraordinarily well preserved, with its very deep crypts dug into the width of the walls and covered in strongly colored religious bas-relief. Its main temple, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, is the largest, covering some 40,000 square meters. It is also one of the most well-preserved temples of the site, if not the best in all of Egypt. It is also one of the most well-decorated of the Ptolemaic era. In Egyptian mythology, Hathor is the goddess of love, beauty, music, motherhood, and joy. She is venerated at Dendera and associated with the god Horus, her husband of the temple at Edfu. She is represented in the form of a woman carrying the solar disk between her horns or as a cow. The first king to whom we attribute the construction of the temple at Dendera is Ptolemy XII. It was surrounded by a thick brick wall, the remains of which still exist today, and demonstrate, if it is still necessary, all the architectural know-how of the ancient Egyptians. The adobe brick wall that surrounds the complex of monuments at Dendera includes the gateway of the Roman emperors Domitian and Trajan, constructed during the final period of the temple at the end of the 1st century. Vestiges of chapels, even Roman ones, can be found at the entrance. The ancient Greeks identify Hathor as the goddess Aphrodite and the Romans as Venus. In Egypt, the goddess of the power of femininity was Isis, but though the two goddesses were initially in competition, they were merged in the later periods, and we see representations of Isis with the haircut of Hathor appear. Hathor is generally represented as a goddess cow, with horns between which the solar disk and uraeus appear. To the east, another part of the city stretches out, with a Coptic basilica in the center. It was probably constructed in the 5th century, which shows the adaptation and appropriation of ancestral cultural sites by the Christian religion. Elsewhere, the necropolis of the city contains very ancient tombs from the pre-dynastic era and the end of the ancient empire. According to the inscriptions relating to the founding of the temple, its layout was inspired by very old documents dating back to Khufu and even mythic times. But currently, the oldest monument still visible is a Mamisi dating from the era of Nectanebo I. Dendera Temple is different from other Greco-Roman temples because it possesses neither monumental pylons nor a porticoed courtyard. 4 columns with capitals ornament the facade, and one accesses the temple by entering directly into the hypostyle hall. The 4 heads of Hathor ornamenting the capitals of each column proclaim the universal character of the goddess. The scenes show the triad of Hathor, Horus, and their son Harsumptus, who is offered the lotus which is linked to the rising sun. Higher up, we see the sacred Horus, the king of kings. The trapezoidal facade is topped by a cornice. At certain hours of the day, the light skimming the architrave allows one to better contemplate the diverse divinities making offerings, who advance towards the centrally located symbol of the goddess, the winged solar disk. The hypostyle hall was decorated at the beginning of our era under the reigns of the Roman emperors Augustus and Nero. 18 Hathoric columns support the ceiling, the capitals of which featured the face of the goddess Hathor on 4 sides, wearing a heavy wig and capped by a sistrum, her favorite musical instrument. These plant-like columns evoke the night in which the moon hides. They represent the primordial swamp from which all creation springs, the source of all life. All of the columns and all of the inner walls are covered by magnificent hieroglyphs, the colors of which are still preserved underneath the dust. The ceiling of the hypostyle hall is divided by architraves into 7 spans. They are a base for astronomic representations, the diurnal trajectory of the sun, the nocturnal trajectory of the moon, the 12 hours of the day and night, and even eclipses. Astronomy is linked to the cult of Hathor, and the priests closely followed the movements of the stars as a way of establishing a precise calendar of religious celebrations. Another span shows the lunar calendar divided in 14 characters representing the phases of the moon. The moon is represented by the eye. The ceiling of the hypostyle hall of the Temple of Dendera is a nearly exhaustive inventory of the astronomic knowledge of the Egyptians during the Ptolemaic era. The interior walls of the hypostyle hall are ornamented with reliefs. Above, on the 4 registers, the names of the Roman emperors who shared the title of pharaoh appear: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. They all worship Hathor and dedicate offerings to her. On one wall, we see the king and a priest as they sense the soul of the ruler. In the sanctuary, they put the boats destined for the goddess as well as her statues. The bas-reliefs depict a succession of daily religious rites the king had to accomplish, like breaking the seals of the door, worshipping Hathor, or offering her incense. Of course, the king himself could not accomplish all these rites on his own. These are the priests who acted as his substitutes for the task. Small, very narrow corridors built into the width of the walls or the foundations lead to small-sized decorated rooms. The crypts, hidden places exclusively reserved for priests. These rooms, arranged in several levels, serve to store divine and sacred objects, the treasures of the temple, religious materials, and the archives. To the right, we enter into the open ceiling courtyard. It precedes the small kiosk of the new year. On the ceiling of the kiosk, we see representations of Nut and of the birth of the sun, which beams its rays onto the temple. Represented here by the head of Hathor, which we recognize by its cow-like ears sticking out of its hair. It stands on a mountain between 2 trees. Halfway up the stairs, the procession would stop in order for the priest to complete all the rituals celebrating the union of the goddess Hathor to the solar disk. The roof of the temple was topped by the kiosk of the disk, laid out on a rectangle with its 12 columns pointing Hathor's face to the 4 cardinal directions. This is where the celebration of the New Year was held each year. With the rising sun, as part of the ceremony called the Union to the Disk, they would transport the statue of Hathor to the roof of the temple so that it could be regenerated by the solar rays of her father Ra. In another kiosk, the ceiling shows a famous map of the sky, the constellations, and the decans, which is known as the Dendera zodiac. The Dendera zodiac is a map of the stars projected on a plane. It shows the 12 constellations of the zodiac, the 36 decans, and the planets. Some of these are represented in the same forms as those of their familiar names, for example, those of Aries, Taurus, Scorpio, Capricorn, or Leo. Moving on, we see a statue of the god Bes on the ground in the courtyard. He is a grotesque pot-bellied god, but also the one who protected the birth of Hathor's divine child. Other scattered stones set the imagination free. Going around the perimeter of the temple, on the rear face, there is a representation of the Queen Cleopatra, accompanied by her son Caesarion, who is fathered by Caesar. Now it's time to leave Hathor here and continue our trip along the Nile to go upriver towards Aswan.